Hello, this is Andrew Hill, talking about the textbook Doing Ethics by Lewis Vaughn. Today, talking about Chapter 2, and specifically looking at the quick review box on page 23, because that's on the second page of the chapter. And it highlights a curious thing about this chapter, which I want to put you on notice about, which is that on the first page, and the beginning of the second page, he says he's going to talk about four major concepts. Those four major concepts are simply objectivism, cultural relativism, subjective relativism, and emotivism. And he says these are four very important approaches to ethics, ways of thinking about and approaching difficult ethical solutions. And he says that we need to understand these four things. But then what happens is he only talks about three of the four. He says objectivism, he gives a brief definition of it. And in fact, he says in the quick review box that it's the view that some moral principles are valid for everyone. But then what happens is he kind of skips over that. And he starts straight into subjective relativism and gives a long, detailed explanation of what it is and specifically lists a number of criticisms about it. He then talks about he goes from subjective to cultural relativism, and then he spends 6 pages talking about that and all the problems that it faces. And then he wraps up by talking about emotivism. And again, lines out all the problems with those 3 approaches and ways of thinking about ethical decision making. And listen, let me tell you, he raises some big, clear problems with these approaches, these schools of thought. He says, this is what it is, and this is why it falls apart. And in fact, even just in the quick review box, when he gives their definitions, look at the box. He lists all 4, but for the first one, he just tells you a definition. The view that some moral principles are valid for everybody. But with the next 3, he gives a definition and then implication. It says, the implications are, and it tells you why it's not going to work. He doesn't do that. He doesn't list any objections, any problems with the first, objectivism. And that's because he's going to come right out and say, that's the one you want to know. He's going to come out and endorse that one. He's going to say there are 4, but these 3 have these big problems. Objectivism is the way to go. In fact, when you look, I mentioned that starting on the second page of the chapter, he lays out subjective relativism, cultural relativism, emotivism in great detail, talking about why they're wrong. The only mention he makes of objectivism is on page 30. If you go and look at the top of the second column, right between where his attack on cultural relativism ends and emotivism begins, he has this to say, which is simply that the crux of the matter is that cultural relativism does a poor job of explaining some important features of our moral experience. A far better explanation of these features is that some form of moral objectivism is true. And then he stops and goes on to emotivism. So again, the only reference you get to objectivism is that one sentence where he says it's true. And the other 3, in fact, all of chapter 2 is about tearing down those other ways of looking at our moral experience. Now, what I've done here is I've outlined this for you because he talks about these 4 concepts. Objectivism over here, and then cultural relativism and subjective relativism. Now, I didn't even put on this scale, this balance, emotivism. I put that way down over here. So number 4 is off in the corner. But what you'll see is that one way to think about this is this line and this seesaw in between. Because what happens to a lot of us is that we kind of feel like we're trapped out on this seesaw. Because sometimes we think objectively, and there are some moral principles that we want to defend as being objective, that is, applying to everyone, everywhere, all the time. But sometimes we also end up thinking and defending our moral decision makings through this kind of cultural relativism. And so we end up kind of running back and forth here and here. Very few of us end up in this space of emotivism, which he's going to define as there being essentially no right and wrong, that there are these moral utterances, the view that moral utterances are neither true nor false, but are expressions of emotions or attitudes. And he launches a kind of a classic attack on emotivism. But you'll also probably think to yourself that you know very few people who fall into that category. It might be logically possible on this scale, but it's really not part of our lived experience that we know a whole lot of people that would fall into that category. In fact, the same is really also true of subjective relativism, because it's not the same as saying that somebody is selfish or self-centered. I think we know lots of people who might fall into that category. But that's different than somebody who believes that they are the source of what's right and wrong. That when they're trying to decide whether something's right or wrong, that as soon as they decide it, then that's settled. And see, that's really not a lot of the selfish people I know. A lot of selfish or self-centered people, they do things which they think might benefit them or their pocketbook or something, but a lot of times they think what they're doing is wrong. And that's a different thing. So we have to make a distinction there between the self-centered and the selfish, and somebody that actually believes that they're doing subjective relativism, which is the view that an action is morally right if one approves of it. That I'm the source of what's good and bad, right or wrong. And that would be problematic. Again, I don't know very many people that fall truly into that category. But when you look at the last two things that we have, you'll see why I think we end up kind of going back and forth between objectivism and cultural relativism. And that is the view, first of all, objectivism, that there are some moral principles that are valid for everybody. And he gives some examples in the chapter, specifically when he's kind of attacking cultural relativism, of things that many people would say, well, yes, that is a principle which applies to everybody all the time, everywhere. And we got to talk about that, because if there is such a principle, if it's truly universal, well then that might be a good guide for judging whether something's good or bad, right or wrong. If there's a principle that can lead us to that and guide us to that knowledge. And there's a distinction, though, between universal and absolutism. Because an absolute interpretation there would be somebody that would say, well, this is universal and there's no exceptions to it whatsoever. And the thinking there is simply that you might start with a moral principle like it's never good to kill innocent people. That's a principle, that's a rule, which applies everywhere, all the time, to everybody. But you might also say, well, okay, maybe there's going to be a couple of exceptions to that. Maybe warfare justifies the killing of innocent civilians. And maybe that's an exception to a universal principle. So I'm not an absolutist. I might think that the bombings that we did during the Second World War, Japan or in Germany, were justified given the context of the war. And that somehow that's not that there's therefore this principle that it's always okay, it's always right to kill innocent civilians. No, but maybe there's a universal principle that there's an exception to. If I don't believe that, if I'm a strict pacifist, let's say, he said there's never any reason to justify that, that would be an absolutist. There's no exceptions to this universal principle. So it's this thinking that there are some moral principles that are going to be guides to our moral decision making. Sometimes with exceptions or not, depending upon that. But then on the other end of this scale, we end up on the relativist side of the house, and that's this view that an action is morally right if one's culture approves of it. And again, it's the source of what's right or wrong. That's the guide. Not a universal principle, but my society, my culture, my country's values. That's what determines right or wrong. And again, in the text he points out why there are problems with that, why there are conflicts. And I think he does a good job of pointing out some of the logical fallacies and errors with emotivism, with subjective relativism, with cultural relativism. But like I said, he doesn't even really address objectivism. He certainly doesn't list any of the problems that are listed there, or that attach themselves to objectivism. In fact, the one sentence he says there on page 30 is that, yeah, the far better explanation for these features is that some form of moral objectivism is true. So he's laying down his cards and saying, these are the four, but this one is a special one that we need to pay attention to. Let me start by tearing apart these other three. I want you to go through the chapter, look at that, make sure you see that he's kind of got an agenda going on with chapter 2 about these four, and one having a privileged position, which is why he doesn't even list an implication for it in the quick review on page 23. So go back to the chapter, think about those four key concepts. What do they mean? And again, when we're trying to master a concept, we need to be able to define it. We need to be able to compare and contrast it to get other examples. And then also be able to generate an example of that. So think about those four things: objectivism, cultural relativism, subjective relativism, and emotivism. And for example, go through and think about marriage. How do these things apply to marriage? If you think that polygamy in other countries is bad, why do you think it's bad? If you think it's okay, why do you think it's okay? And not just giving reasons for them, but latching onto the source of what determines whether something is good or bad. Is it that your culture approves of it? Is it that you think it's right or wrong? Is it that there is really no true statements? We have neither true nor false statements about these things. They're just expressions of emotions. Or are there principles that play, these moral principles which are universal and perhaps even absolute? And if so, where do those come from? How do we know what they are? How do we discover them? So think about marriage in that as an example of these things, and play with that in your mind with these four key concepts from chapter 2, and we'll come back to that again later. Take care.